Producer surplus, this is important because we're going to apply this over and over again going forward in the course to analyze the welfare effects of different types of policies. All right, so I'm going to start with a supply function that starts at the origin down here at 0 and is a positively sloped. I've got, again, it's the summation of the negative inverse of the marginal cost curves across all of the individual firms. We're looking at the market here because I've got a capital Q. I haven't indicated the quantities that we're measuring things in or the prices. That won't matter too much in our explanation right here. What I'm going to do, though, is first just tell you where producer surplus is found on the diagram. If you've got a supply function like this and a market price P1, then the producer surplus is going to be given by that triangular area, the area between the price that prevails in the marketplace, the supply function, and the vertical axis. Now, let me explain a little bit about what that is in the context of our model, because we can give some more tangible associations, or we can recognize what that's really measuring a little bit by looking at the right-hand side over here. Okay, so let's start with some relationships that we know about. So first of all, the measurement of profit for an individual firm is going to be given by total revenue minus total variable cost minus total fixed cost. Okay, we gave that definition before in general. This is how we would measure profit. Now from the graph, okay, so from over here, we can note that price times quantity, so P1 times Q1, this vertical distance times this horizontal distance, is going to give us the area of that entire rectangle, right? And so given from what I've got drawn there, that's going to be equal to the upper part of the triangle, PS, producer surplus, plus the bottom side. And that bottom triangle here actually turns out to be the total variable cost in the production process itself. It so happens that going from 0 to the quantity and measuring everything under the marginal cost curve is going to be summing up the total variable cost that the firms are responsible for across the entire market. Okay, again, this kind of comes from an exercise in calculus, maybe. That's the easiest way to understand this. We're not going to go through that derivation, but just take it then for granted that the underbelly of this supply curve is going to be the total variable cost. Okay, so that means total revenue is equal to total variable cost plus producer surplus. Now, let's do a substitution. The profit function from up here, we're going to redo down here, but we're going to take this term and we're going to plug it in for total revenue. All right, and that's what I've done down here. So total variable cost plus producer surplus is the same as total revenue. So plug it in, subtract off total variable cost, subtract off total fixed cost. Notice when we do that at a particular quantity level, the total variable costs are going to cancel out from each other. And that's going to leave us with an expression that says that profits in the industry are going to be equal to total producer surplus, the above part of this triangle, minus total fixed costs. One more rearrangement, moving producer surplus over to one side of the equation and the profits over to the other, gives us this relationship right here. Producer surplus is nothing more than the sum total of short-term profits that firms are making in the industry, plus the payments that they must make to the fixed costs of production. Okay, now, that's technically what producer surplus is, but in practical terms, in terms of our interpretation and what we're going to kind of be thinking about and using it for, we can just sort of think about it as being the profits that are accruing to the firms in the perfectly competitive market. Now remember, firms don't make profits in the long run in this market, but they do make profits in the short run. And so what we're representing with producer surplus are those short run profits that are accruing to firms in a particular industry. Okay, and that's how we should think of that triangular area. So firms care about their own well-being. If they do so, profits is the measurement of their well-being, and we're imagining the firms are trying to maximize their profitability. That's a representation of how well a firm or how well firms in a market happen to be doing. So producer surplus gives us this way of representing producer well-being, producer welfare, we're going to say. So welfare just is used here to refer to the well-being or the happiness, if you will, that's accruing on the firm side or the production side of the marketplace. All right, and then we're going to use that in conjunction with consumer surplus, which is a measurement of consumer welfare or well-being that's accruing to consumers in the marketplace. Now here I want to make just a quick representation of consumer and producer surplus and how we represent a market equilibrium. What have I got next? We'll do that. Okay, so now we've got a supply curve and a demand curve. It intersects at some particular point, generating a market price. Let's call it P sub E. It's generating a quantity. I'm calling it Q100 for the amount of goods that are being produced in the marketplace. And here's what I want you to remember from this particular diagram now. When we talk about a market supply and demand and a quantity being traded, this corresponds to thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of individual transactions that are taking place in the marketplace. So if Q100 corresponds to, say, 100 million units of the good being sold, right? Then there's somebody buying 1 unit, there's somebody out there buying 10 units, there's somebody out there buying 25 units, there's a bunch of people that are buying small quantities of these goods. And each individual that buys it is a consumer whose demands are being represented in part on the demand curve here. And they're coming into a marketplace where they're seeing a price for a product displayed, and they're making a decision about whether to purchase the product at that price or not. The firms are making products available for sale, and they're saying, here's the price we're going to charge, and you're free to purchase this product or not. But when this quantity gets sold, it corresponds to lots of individuals. So let's take individual or unit number 10, both on the consumer and the producer side. Unit number 10 was produced by somebody. It was a part of the supply, total supply in the marketplace, and it was consumed by somebody. Now, the consumer that purchased unit 10 may well have been willing to pay a much higher price for the product than they actually paid at PE. And as a result, they got this much surplus as a result of the sale that took place at the price PE. The producer would have been willing to sell the product at a much lower price, but they got the price PE, and they received also this much surplus or extra profitability as a result of that one transaction that took place. As a result, we could recognize now that what's really happening in that one transaction is we got two people coming together, a firm and a consumer. The consumer is endowed with money over here. The producer is endowed with goods, and they're trading money for goods into the middle of an Edgeworth box, right? And both of them are getting to a higher indifference curve than they would have been on had they not traded, right? I've got those indifference curves represented there, sorry. But they're both getting to a higher indifference curve. That means they're both getting extra utility or surplus value as a result of the trade. Now, this vertical distance here represents the extra surplus value accruing on the producer side of this trade. This extra surplus value corresponds to the amount of extra utility consumers are getting, both measured in dollar terms. And then we're doing that for consumer number 10, for consumer number 20, for consumer number whatever, right? So we've got all of these individual trades that are taking place, adding up to the market total at the end of 100 units or 100 million units, however we want to measure it. All right, so think about the power of this. This is really important. This one supply and demand curve now is really incorporating all of the assumptions we've made in our models going back to the beginning of the course. Assume that Smith and Jones have preferences over apples and oranges, over coffee. Suppose that two individuals come to a market and trade with each other, a consumer and a firm. Let's say the only difference now in this depiction is that when we talked about the Edgeworth box, we imagined that the two individuals could haggle or barter over what the price would be. Now the price is determined. The terms of trade that they're going to trade upon is determined by the marketplace. It's the total market supply and market demand that's setting the terms of trade. And then the individuals are making decisions about how much to produce and how much to consume, given that the market price is now determined at price PE. Okay, but with this diagram, we can now use it to measure the amount of consumer surplus or happiness that's accruing to all of the consumers down here. We're getting all of their increases in utility measured in area A on this diagram. And we're getting all of the increased benefits accruing to producers measured by this area B, where A represents the area of this triangle, B represents the area of this triangle down below. And so market welfare is going to be given by the sum total of areas A and B. That's how much total happiness benefits are accruing to both the consumers and the producers as a result of trades that take place at the price PE and a quantity Q100 here. So suppose I give you a supply and demand curve here, and I represent the prices conceptually, I'm going to call it, where I'm not putting actual values in for it. I'm just measuring the price in equilibrium as PE, the quantity is QE, and then areas on the graph could be represented with letters, and that's what I'm doing here. So A is inside of this triangle here. So A is going to correspond to the area of that triangle. That's what that means. B is inside of this triangle, so B is going to correspond to the area of that triangle. C is in this triangle, so it's going to correspond to the area of that triangle, and so forth. So I could ask you, what is consumer surplus in the marketplace? In a conceptual term, you're just going to write down consumer surplus as area A. What is producer surplus? It's area B. What is total revenue? I could ask that. Well, it's the sum total, price times quantity. That's going to be area B plus C on the graph. What's total variable cost? That's going to be area C on the graph. That's up here. So this is what I call a conceptual analysis. We're not getting actual values of these individual quantities and prices. We're not doing the exact mathematical calculation. We're just keeping track of them visually on the graph. But there's another method, method 2. I could associate numbers with each of these, 1,000 units, a price of 3, an intercept term of 6 up here. And then I could ask you to actually calculate consumer surplus, calculate producer surplus, calculate market welfare. And then you're going to go through and figure out what is the actual numerical value for the area A. That's consumer surplus, and it's going to work out to be $1,500. What's that for producer surplus? It's going to turn out to be $1,500 as well. Add them up to get market welfare. It's going to be $3,000.